This is the 172 module from Behringer's System 100, and it's essentially the effects module of this system. It consists of 4 sections: the phase shifter or phaser, an audio delay, which is basically a flanger, an LFO to modulate these two, and a gate delay. Phaser and flanger have a very unique character, and you don't want to miss them in the whole System 100 setup. Before we switch to the details of the 172 module and listen to some sounds, of course, let's go behind the scenes and see how phasers and flangers work. Let's start with the easier to understand flangers, or in case of the 172 module, the flanger is called audio delay. The flanger splits the incoming audio signal into 2 signals, processes one through a delay and mixes it back together with the original signal. We can also see this here in the schematics of the 172 module. Here the input audio signal gets split, the upper path goes to the mixing op-amp directly, and the lower signal passes through a voltage controllable bucket brigade delay before it goes to the mixer. From a high-level perspective, the result seems very simple. With this sawtooth wave here as an example, we just add a further peak to the waveform here at the point where we add the shifted waveform to the original one. And we can now change the resulting waveform by altering the delay amount. Right now, when we shift to about half of the length, we receive a doubling of the original frequency, and it looks like a dual sawtooth wave. And consequently, in the frequency spectrum, the second harmonic is now dominant. So obviously this audio delay, which is mixed with the original signal, or what we call a flanger, allows to generate very different characters out of a simple waveform. However, the theory behind is a bit more complex. First, we have to remember that we can express every waveform by a set of sine waves with different amplitudes and frequencies added together, which is the fundamental principle of additive synthesis. Let's start with the single sine wave with 220 Hz, so an A2, and now we add a second sine wave with 2 times 220 Hz and half the amplitude, and a third wave with 3 times 220 Hz and 1/3 of the amplitude, and so on and so on. For 6 sine waves, the result looks like this, and is already quite close to a sawtooth wave. So by doing this reverse engineering, we demonstrated that the sawtooth wave and other waveforms can be expressed by a set of sine waves. The frequencies of the sine waves are called the harmonics of the waveform, and the first sine wave with the lowest frequency is the fundamental one, which defines the pitch of the resulting sound. Now let's see what happens if we shift the sawtooth wave by a certain amount and mix it with the original one. And we do this by looking at the decomposed saw wave in form of the set of the first 3 sine waves. If we shift it by half of the third sine wave's period, we actually cancel the third sine wave in the output of the flanger when we add the original and the shifted sine waves together. Therefore, the output waveform changes its character and loses one of its harmonics. A further shift will then cancel the second sine wave, and the sound loses its first harmonic, so the audio delay leads to a significant change in the output waveform, and can be roughly compared to a COM filter. Flanging often results in a psychedelic or outerworldly sound, and you typically modulate the delay time by an LFO or an envelope, which adds to the character of the flanger. Okay, next is the phaser. Unlike the flanger, the phaser shifts the phase of a subset of frequencies of our sound, and not all frequencies like the flanger did. And like the flanger, it mixes the partially shifted sound with the original to achieve cancellations of the shifted harmonics. The phaser uses a component called an all-pass filter. We all know low-pass filters, which filter out the higher frequencies of our sound. High-pass filters, in contrast, do the opposite and filter out the lower frequencies. All-pass filters now don't filter anything out. Their filter curve looks like this, so all frequencies can pass through without attenuation. Seems pretty useless. However, if we look at the phase plot of the all-pass filter, we see that in this area here, the filter gradually shifts the phase of the incoming frequencies. So what does this mean? Let's visualize this with a simple sine wave again, as it has only one frequency. A low-pitch sine now passes the all-pass filter without any change. But if we increase the pitch, the output sine wave gets shifted in phase, even more with further pitch increase, until finally we reach a 180-degree phase shift. The phase shift isn't audible when we listen to the output signal alone, since it doesn't matter if we play the sound now or shift it by a few milliseconds. It will sound the same. You hear the original sound now on the left and the shifted one on the right, so there is no difference at all. But if we mix the original and the shifted sound together, which we remember does the phaser by its internal connections, the result is very different. At this point here, the shifted sound is inverted compared to the original one, and consequently they cancel each other out. We now only hear a very low, close to inaudible result. The power of this resulting sound therefore changes with the amount of phase shift. The usual phasers use a whole array of all-pass filters, and they are also called the stages of the phaser, and every filter has this 180-degree phase shift. So the complete filter diagram of a 6-stage phaser looks like this, and different frequencies of the input sound now become phase shifted by different amounts, which leads to very different cancellations of frequencies depending on the input sound and its frequency content. And typically we can also shift the all-pass filters along the frequency range, so they are voltage controllable. When we feed a single sine wave through the phase shifter and increase the pitch of this sine wave, we can now see that the phase shifter output changes with the pitch of the sine wave as we run across the filter diagram and achieve an increasing phase shift. Always when we reach these 180 degrees here in the shift, the output is nearly cancelled out, and with further increase it comes back, and then it runs through the second shift and it reaches its original state again at 360 degrees, and then it gets cancelled out when we shift it by another 180 degrees, so a total of 540 degrees. And finally here we reach a 1080 degree shift, which is 3 times 360, so the original signal again, and consequently this 172 module here features a 6-stage phaser, which we can also see in the respective schematics. Now I use 2 sine waves that are 1 octave apart, and with low phase shifter frequency both sine waves are visible and audible in the output. And when I increase the phase shifter frequency, the higher sine wave gets cancelled out first, and we only see and hear the lower one now, and with higher setting the lower sine wave cancels itself out and only the higher one passes through. With a bit of tuning we can also set both frequencies to match the 180 degrees sections of the filter diagram, and consequently both frequencies are cancelled out. So lots of unpredictable and interesting stuff here, and of course with more complex sounds and the voltage control of this phaser, this becomes even more interesting. And we can also add resonance to these all-pass filters, which leads to some very uncommon additional harmonics and also some lovely distortion. And by the way, this also holds for the flanger. Okay, that's enough of the theory. Let's now see how the specific implementations of phaser and flanger in the 172 module look like. Here we have the phaser or phase shifter here with the audio input, the output, and a modulation input for the frequencies of the 6 internal all-pass filters. This here is a bypass switch which switches the output between the dry signal, so the same as the input, in the off position, and we get the wet signal in the on position. And we remember that the wet signal is a mix of the original and the phase shifted one. Here we can attenuate the modulation amount, and the modulation input is internally normal to the LFO here in the lower part of the module, which outputs a triangle wave. And when we plug a cable into here, we can break this internal connection and use our own modulation signals. This here is the manual frequency control, and the modulation goes on top of this setting here. Here we have the resonance of the all-pass filters. It has no CV input and we can only tune it manually. So let's listen to some sounds with the phase shifter. This is the audio delay section, or the flanger, and it has a very similar setup to the phase shifter, with the audio in and output here, the modulation input here, again normal to the internal LFO, and here we have the resonance setting. The maximal delay is quite short in the millisecond range, and with an external mod input we can increase the delay time, but even with a 10 volt input it is still quite short. And I guess these longer delay times are not the real purpose of this audio delay, because its primary use is in terms of the flanger. So let's listen to some sounds with the delay. Here we have the LFO, whose primary task is to modulate phaser and flanger, but we can also grab the triangle wave and the inverted one here to use it for other purposes. But, well, the features of this LFO are very limited, and it has no CV input for the frequency, no reset, and only one waveform. And apart from that, a few strange quirks. The frequency spans from about 10 Hz down to about 0.01 Hz, or 1 minute and 10 seconds of cycle time. The output wave becomes asymmetric with lower frequencies, and also the amplitude of the waveform grows as we decrease its frequency. With higher frequency setting, the output wave has a peak-to-peak voltage of as low as 0.5, but with lower frequencies this increases to about 10 volts peak-to-peak. So all in all, quite an unusual LFO. However, I guess it's true to the original here, at least when it comes to the changing amplitude, because that actually leads to a more pleasant modulation of the effects, which otherwise tend to get annoying when you turn up the modulation frequency and don't reduce the modulation amount. So this LFO here probably has one purpose, and this is modulating these effects. Finally, here we have the gate delay, which is independent of the rest of this module, but nevertheless a very useful tool. And since we had an audio delay here, it's quite straightforward that we also have a gate delay. We can feed a gate signal into here and delay the gate output by a certain time, where the maximal delay is about 6 seconds. So you feed your gate or even a short trigger into here, and it takes about 6 seconds now until the gate appears at the output, indicated by this green LED. A short trigger is actually sufficient to fire up this circuit, as the output signal is decoupled from the length of the input signal. The length of the output gate can be set here, and again between about 50 milliseconds and 6 seconds. So in this setting now it takes 6 seconds until the gate output comes up after I triggered the input, and then the gate stays high for another 6 seconds. The threshold here sets the minimal voltage required for the trigger input to fire the gate, and with the lowest setting 0.25 volts are enough. With the highest setting you roughly need 5 volt to get the electrons in motion here. Apart from the obvious use of this circuit as a delay for envelopes or stuff like that, one could also use it as a clock divider by either increasing the delay or the gate time above the cycle time of the input signal. So to wrap it all up, the 172 is one of the very interesting modules of the System 100, and if I had to keep one of the whole series, it would be this. The character phaser and flanger add even to simple sounds is just marvelous, and especially the phaser adds some sort of tension or spring-loaded feeling, which I really love. The gate delay is super handy, and the LFO is, well, special, and I mostly use an external signal to drive the modulation of the two effects. Either envelopes or another LFO with more elaborate waveform choices do the job here. Perhaps a little issue is the resonance of the flanger, which kicks in very late, and there may be a bad choice of potentiometer here, which wouldn't be the only case in Behringer System 100. The faders in the portamento module are also quite odd. So all in all, this module really enhances the System 100 sounds, interacts beautifully with the harmonics, and is a real must-have.